Hi everyone, thanks for taking the time to check out my talk for this symposium on ecomedia in the Anthropocene. My name is Dan Platt and I'm an assistant professor of English at Graceland University, which is a tiny university in the tiny town of Lamoni in south central Iowa. The title of my talk today is Open Educational Resources and Ecomedia Pedagogy, Surveying the Landscape. So if you're not familiar with the conversation about open educational resources, or OER, the term refers to teaching and learning materials, texts, guides and annotations, video, podcasts that are made freely available online, typically under a Creative Commons license. Most often, that license allows for the materials to be revised or remixed or adapted, provided there's attribution for the original creator. Researching this presentation, I learned that there are many awesome resources for the environmental humanities or for eco-cinema and media, many of them created by presenters at this conference. Hopefully I can post a list of them alongside my presentation. What I was really hoping to find, but didn't ultimately discover, was a solid and fully developed open textbook that could be used in an environmental film class, or for that matter, in a general introduction to the environmental humanities. By textbook, I mean a book, in this case a digital book, that aims to convey a standard approach to the subject of ecomedia or the environmental humanities, one that lays out the broadly shared assumptions about the field and its methods in language that's accessible to an audience with little or no prior training in literary or film studies. I should say up front that I talk about ecomedia and the environmental humanities together in this presentation, partly because I need both to serve the classes I teach right now, but also because I can imagine a single open textbook that would offer an introduction to environmental approaches to texts, and then include different sections on analyzing film text, literary text, and so forth. My argument in this presentation is that there's value to be found in creating such a textbook, and that we, and by we I mean this body of ASLE goers and members, could assemble that textbook collaboratively with the help of our students. Now, to be honest, I chose this presentation topic to force myself to look deeper into the world of OER and to decide if this is something I wanted to spend time on and to integrate into my classes. In hindsight, this presentation might have been better suited for a roundtable discussion format. I guess one of the extra benefits of the nearly carbon neutral format, though, is that none of you can throw rotten vegetables at me if you think my talk is bad or boring. In any case, the deeper assumption that's built into this argument for an open media, eco-media textbook is that we should create access points to the world of environmental humanities for as many students as we possibly can. I'm thinking specifically about high school students, students in community colleges, STEM students taking classes to fulfill a requirement, students who aren't already convinced that there's a value in the study of the humanities. I think this is important because I think the work we do, drawing out the cultural assumptions that are built into our perceptions of and our behavior toward non-human nature, presenting students with ideas and arguments that challenge their worldviews, convincing them that other ways of living and being are possible, asking them to think and write critically about environmental issues. All of these things are essential to the future of human life on Earth. I also believe that we don't have a lot of time left to make this case. In a neat bit of serendipity, shortly after I submitted my abstract for this presentation, Amy McIntyre and Mark Long sent an email to the ASLE listserv asking about the creation of an ASLE working group on open educational resources. The questions that Mark Long posed for the working group at the outset were these three. How might members of the association use open education to move our teaching and research activities into communities outside the academy? How might ASLE offer undergraduate and graduate students opportunities to create and access OERs, as well as to promote student agency in intellectual communities within and beyond their home institutions? How might OERs create new partnerships with non-academic stakeholders as we continue to work on common challenges and projects in the environmental arts and humanities? I'm really committed to the basic premise that's beneath these questions. They're outward looking, focused on the idea of a public mission for humanities scholarship. They're driven by a commitment to inclusivity and collaboration. I'd like to talk about that argument and those assumptions and how an open textbook focused on ecomedia and the environmental humanities might serve those ends. I'd also like to make a case for the value of an open textbook just for our own students. To me, a commitment to accessibility also makes for good classroom pedagogy. As someone who teaches at a small rural liberal arts college with many under-resourced students, the most functional argument for OER, that it's a way to reduce cost for students, really resonates with me. I've had many students who told me frankly that they can't afford to buy the books for my classes. For a while, I thought I could solve this problem by putting those texts on closed reserve at the library. Even then, though, I lost students for whom that extra step of going to the library every week is too burdensome, often for really valid reasons, like they usually do homework while they're working a campus desk job somewhere else, or they don't have childcare to spend an hour at the library. The past few years, I've made a lot of changes to my teaching methods to invite those students back into the conversation, and I think that creating free learning materials that can be freely accessed anywhere with just a cell phone and a signal is a logical extension of that pedagogical project. In addition, many students that I teach aren't sold on the value of the humanities and haven't been prepared for the kind of analytical thinking and writing that takes place in these classes. For me, one of the great opportunities of an open textbook is the chance to create an introduction to our field that's not only accessible, but inviting to students. I honestly think we could draw some lessons from the nonprofit sector here about framing and messaging our work as environmental humanists in a way that appeals to people's shared beliefs and values. I believe it's possible to present our field to students in a way that faithfully represents the complexity and nuance and disagreement that it contains, but also in a language that can reach students who don't already have a foundation in literary studies. I mean, this is ultimately what all of us do in class every day, but I feel like there's a gap in the market when it comes to written resources that serve that same function. Let's talk about the open textbook market for a minute. For the most part, the development of open textbooks and other educational resources has been concentrated in areas with high course enrollment and high textbook costs, such as math and science. And when you look at some of the funding sources for the creation of open textbooks, it's hard not to imagine that investment in the development of open educational resources could leave classes like ours in the environmental humanities behind. If that happens, we risk deepening this already present divide where the liberal arts are perceived as a luxury that only students who come from backgrounds of economic and cultural privilege can afford to pursue. I think there's a real value and a real urgency in creating open resources to serve lower enrollment courses, such as those in the humanities, which are taught less frequently and often without a textbook. Creating open resources for the niche courses that I teach in eco-cinema and the environmental humanities is one small way to underscore the idea that such courses aren't luxuries for the privileged few, but that they should be accessible to all people. Also, I think more instructors might teach eco-media or the environmental humanities if they knew there were free resources they could draw on to support their course development. For people who are teaching 4 or 5 or more classes a semester, the choice to add new material or to take a different approach to a course is often a question of time. A textbook that could support that instructor in a foray into eco-criticism might go a long way. The same goes for high school teachers who might have the opportunity to offer an elective related to ecomedia or to integrate a unit that engages with environmental approaches to film or literature. Or imagine an instructor for an introduction to film class who might be considering a focus on environmental issues as a course theme or for a portion of the course. Ultimately, if you share my evangelical zeal for spreading the ideas and strategies we practice in the environmental humanities beyond our classrooms and beyond the classrooms of the privileged few, I think exploring OER options is an excellent way to begin. Now, I'd like to make a kind of conservative argument for that relic of old school pedagogy, the textbook. Remember that warm feeling you had when Robin Williams asked his fresh-faced prep school students to tear out the pages of their literature textbook? Just imagine the exact opposite feeling right now. In my back-of-the-envelope tally of environmental film syllabi that have been published online, I found that the majority aren't organized around one textbook. As I was looking through these syllabi, I wondered, did the instructor choose not to use a textbook because they're opposed to the idea of using a textbook, or because they didn't find good textbooks to use? I'm curious about how you all would respond. For me, it was definitely the latter. I just couldn't find a good one to assign to my students, and one that would be worth the money that they would be expected to pay for it. And so my argument for an open textbook is based partly on my own experience floundering in attempts to teach an introductory level environmental cinema without a textbook. In that class, I had students with a range of different abilities and investment in the material. The class meets twice a week for 2 hours. The first 2-hour session is a screening day. If I'm teaching a shorter film, I can provide some introduction or context. The second 2-hour session is devoted to discussion, close reading of scenes from the week's film, and usually a short lecture on a key concept from ecomedia studies or the environmental humanities. For me, the greatest value of a textbook is that it allows me to dig deeper into the field in that limited time that I have with students. The more time I spent presenting introductions to foundational concepts like what is the wilderness or what is wilderness, the less time I have to dive deeply into applications of those concepts like how is wilderness imagined in the film Walkabout. A good textbook will be one that takes care of some of that intellectual labor for me. Because it frees up class time, it also creates more room to model good discussion, to practice formal analysis and close reading, and to work on building writing skills with activities like peer reviewing one another's essay theses. In addition, and I think this is particularly important for students who aren't already convinced about the value of the humanities, textbooks are a way to legitimate a field of study for students. I always face some skepticism when I teach environmental humanities. A textbook tells a student that the field is bigger than me and that the ideas I'm teaching aren't just my personal opinions, but a representation of knowledge shared by many different scholars and experts. I work hard to convince my students that these ideas are meaningful and important, but I think there's value in having other voices to support me when my own ethos fails. There are many reasons to argue that traditional textbooks are themselves archaic and unnecessary teaching tools. Robin DeRosa, an OER advocate who teaches at Plymouth State University, captures that argument when she writes, "I don't want to be part of a movement that is focused on replacing static, overpriced textbooks with static, free textbooks. Textbooks, if we don't re-theorize them, have generally just been repositories for the master's ideas," end quote. That's where the distinct features of OER are most useful. DeRosa goes on to argue for the importance of flexibility and adaptability, for allowing resources to be continuously revised, updated, and annotated by the community that's using them, both instructors and students. This is certainly a cliche, but the eco-media landscape is rapidly changing, and the openness of such a textbook is a way to ensure that the canon can expand as new films emerge and as relevant films are rediscovered, recovered, or restored. And of course, this is made possible without forcing students to bear the costs of an update. So with the rest of the time I have, I'd like to just talk about what it might actually look like to create an eco-media or environmental humanities textbook, and particularly one that represents that commitment to openness that DeRosa advocates. There's a lot more to this section that I cut for time, so maybe we could get into these questions more in the comments section. I've come up with 3 simple questions as a guide to moving forward, though, with an open eco-media textbook. First, what shape would an OER eco-media studies textbook actually take? In other words, what is the actual content of the book? Earlier, I discussed the importance of texts written in accessible and inviting language and that make a case for the value of the field to students who might be skeptical readers. Beyond that, I imagine 4 varieties of content instructors might want in an eco-media textbook. These aren't mutually exclusive, and in my experience, many of the commonly used film textbooks try to incorporate a little bit of all 4 approaches with varying degrees of success. The first is a text organized around key concepts in eco-media and environmental cinema, including terms related to the formal qualities of film as a medium. Second is a text organized around a historical narrative of environmental representations in film or other media. Third will be a text organized around case studies of specific films, television programs, or other media artifacts. And then finally, you might have a text organized more as a practical guide for writing and talking about eco-media. And I'm imagining Timothy Corrigan's A Short Guide to Writing About Film as a kind of model here. Second question is, how might scholars at different institutions collaborate on such a project? To me, the ideal open textbook will be one that creates a kind of unified and coherent representation of the field, but that also includes many different voices and approaches. That's certainly a challenge, but I've seen well-crafted, edited collections with well-developed support materials that meet that definition. In the foreword to the textbook, Keywords for Environmental Studies, which I think offers a good model for this kind of work, Lawrence Buell argues that the book aims to satisfy reasonable desires for grounding and clarification, and at the same time to put readers on notice that most of the concepts are arenas of discourse without unitary canonical definitions, end quote. I think that achieving that means bringing in an array of different voices who share a common vision. Ultimately, for some people, OER is unfortunately synonymous with shoddy scholarship. And I have seen some open textbooks that are poorly edited, sourced heavily from Wikipedia, and that contain obvious, unacknowledged, and troubling biases. For me, one of the merits of launching a collaborative textbook project with a small group of ASLE scholars is that peer review could be built into the process from the early stages. The final question I want to address is, what role can undergraduate students play in the construction of these resources? One of the benefits of the open textbook model is that it opens a door for students to participate in the creation of knowledge that might have a life beyond the course. I owe a great debt to my colleague at Graceland, Tim Robbins, who has served as a generous and patient guide to OER for me, and whose work with students on the Rebus Press Open Anthology of Early American Literature helped to convince me of the merits of involving students in the textbook creation process in every step of the process, from editing to content creation and so forth. In my experience, when students can imagine a real audience for their research and writing, the work improves noticeably. And just looking at some of the publicly available materials that students have created in other environmental humanities courses, for example, the Petrofictionary created by students at Memorial University in Newfoundland, I'm really in awe. I think there's a value too in moving across institutional boundaries to create collaboration among students from different universities. It would give students an opportunity to practice student-to-student peer review, give them an exposure to challenging new ideas, and also with more students involved, it seems more likely that the resources will be used by others. So just to sum up, I think that the tools that we as eco-media scholars and environmental humanists can offer people for making meaning from the world around them are too valuable to keep for ourselves and the students who are fortunate enough to take our classes. I think that OER offers us a real opportunity to reach people with those ideas that we aren't currently reaching, both inside and outside of our institutions. And I think that an open textbook aimed at introducing students to eco-media and the environmental humanities could be an important first step in that larger project. I'd welcome any feedback that you care to leave for me, from recommendations for further reading on these issues, which I'm admittedly very new to, objections and healthy skepticism to the idea of an open textbook for the environmental humanities or for eco-media, answers to the 3 questions that I just posed, or suggestions for next steps for this textbook project. All of these things. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I hope that we can create some active discussion in the comments, and I'm looking forward to seeing the other presentations. Thanks a lot.